The rain falls like judgment, relentless and cold, soaking the forgotten alley where the city hides its sins. Neon lights flicker weakly through the storm, bending and breaking across puddles that reflect more blood than water. And somewhere in that chaos, she appears. She's running, or maybe just trying to. Her steps falter, her hand presses against her side where the red spreads, thick and warm. The rain tries to wash it away, but it only makes the crimson bloom brighter. Each breath she takes is a battle, each heartbeat a betrayal. Her white dress, once a symbol of innocence, of escape, now tells a story of pain, of choices that led her back to him. The sound of her heels fades into the distance, swallowed by thunder. And then, he steps out of the shadows. The king. The man who built an empire on fear and silence. His name carries weight, his presence commands obedience. But tonight, as the lightning flashes across his face, he doesn't look like a god or a monster. He looks like a man, human, breakable, haunted. She collapses before she reaches him, her body finally surrendering to gravity. But before she hits the cold ground, his arms are there, catching her, holding her, as if the years between them never existed. Her blood stains his white shirt, spreading across the fabric like a wound that belongs to them both. For the first time in his life, his hands tremble. He looks down at her, searching her face for answers he doesn't want to hear. Her lips move, but only a whisper escapes. He leans closer, rain dripping from his hair, his voice barely steady. "Who shot you?" Her eyes, fading, glassy, meet his. And with a voice so fragile it could shatter, she says, "Someone close, someone you trust." The words slice through the thunder. Time slows. Somewhere, distant sirens echo, meaningless noise in a world that has just shifted. He stares at her, unblinking, and in that moment the city's most feared man feels something he hasn't felt in years, fear. Not of death, but of truth. Because in his world, betrayal never comes from strangers. It comes from those who know where the heart is buried. He pulls her closer, shielding her from the rain as if his arms could protect her from the world. But it's too late for that. The past has found them both, and it bleeds through every drop falling from the sky. She closes her eyes, a faint trace of peace softening the corners of her lips. And as her breathing slows, he realizes, this isn't just an attack. It's a message. The king of the city, untouchable, unbreakable, now stands powerless, drenched in rain, wrapped in loss, and facing a truth he can't escape. What happens when the most feared man in the city discovers the real enemy wears his name? The storm has only begun. They called him the king of the city, as if a crown could be stitched to a suit. Lorenzo De Luca moved through the world with the measured grace of a man who had learned, long ago, how to make other people move for him. He spoke in short sentences and long silences. He smiled like a closing door. Under streetlights and in smoke-filled rooms, his name opened ledgers and closed wounds. To the casual eye he was untouchable, the quiet force clearing paths where lesser men stumbled and bled. But a quiet thing can have a noisy heart. Lorenzo's hands were never idle. They counted paper, pressed pens, folded envelopes, and signed deals with the environmentally neutral flourish of a man who never wanted to look back. There was a small, private ritual he performed each morning before the city woke: black coffee, a mirror, a tie tightened to the exact notch he'd worn since he'd been a boy. That tie had seen more money laundered than the banks, more promises made than churches. He kept his vices tidy, cards stacked, knives sheathed, favors recorded, and his loneliness private. Respect was currency, fear, collateral. A montage of the life he ran played like a silent film inside the narrator's mind, a ledger sliding across a mahogany table and hands transferring envelopes, a backroom handshake under the hum of a single bulb, a glass raised at a table where men laughed and pretended to believe in each other. There were smiles that hid knives and toasts that marked contracts signed in blood. There were safe houses with maps on the wall, red pins marking lines that were never crossed, and men who would have died for him without asking why. Lorenzo gave orders like a conductor raises his baton, and his orchestra killed in perfect rhythm. But power, the narrator says, is an architecture built on mistakes left uncorrected. In Lorenzo's private rooms, the rooms no one cleaned except for the furniture, a photograph rested face down beneath a stack of unpaid invoices. He knew, as he knew the weight of a bullet between thumb and forefinger, that he had let one thing slip through his fingers years ago, a woman with piano-calloused fingertips and a laugh that could soften the edges of his anger. Her name was Elena Rossi. Elena had been a quiet rebellion inside him. Once, when he still believed that a soft thing could survive in hard places, she played Chopin in the back room of a nightclub he owned, her wrists moving like someone coaxing warmth from cold metal. He loved her the way a man who builds walls loves the one blade that could cut them down, secretly, recklessly. She left him like a winter wind, not violent, just gone, and the space she left had been filled with deals and men and silence. Years passed. The photograph remained face down. He told himself he had done the right thing, the city needed iron hands. He told himself she had chosen a life of safety over his dangerous affection. He told himself stories until the truth dulled at the edges. Rumors, though, are riverbeds that never quite dry. Whispers of Elena resurfaced like driftwood after a storm. At first they were nothing but smoke, a woman seen with men Lorenzo did not know, a piano heard in a room no longer on his map. Then the whispers grew teeth, Elena seen in meetings, Elena near an enemy warehouse, Elena smiling too easily in a city where easy smiles came with knives attached. Men who would not lie to Lorenzo brought him these stories wrapped in caution. He did not believe them. How could he? Loyalty, in his mind, had the stubbornness of an oak. Elena had once been his oak. There was no room in his architecture for treachery. The city, as any good narrator will remind you, is its own character, a living, breathing thing that eats secrets and excretes violence. It spoke in sirens and closed doors, in the hum of neon and the slick slide of rain down concrete. Streetlights kept selective watch. Nightclubs swallowed names and spit out debts. Police cars glided past with open hands into pockets of men on payroll. Neighborhoods wore loyalty like coats, heavy, warm in winter and too much in summer. The city taught lessons early, money could buy protection, protection could buy time, time could buy anything but absolution. In that city, loyalty had an expiration date stamped with invisible ink. The people who survived longest were the ones who memorized the small print. And then the city made its move. What the narrator calls the inciting incident arrives with the inevitability of a storm hitting a coastline, slow to build, sudden to wreck. Lorenzo's convoy, a procession he had assembled like a chess opening, was scheduled to exchange arms on a midnight road lined with warehouses. Routine, they'd called it. Nothing to worry about, they'd said. He liked routine. Routine meant control. They were halfway through the exchange when the world peeled open. A crack of latex black sky, the soft answer of a rifle at a distance, and a woman standing across the yard went down like a marionette with cut strings. The shot was not for Lorenzo. The shot was for a figure he tried not to see. For a heartbeat, the narrator allows the scene to stretch, the smell of oil and gunpowder, the metallic bright of panic, men yelling in syllables cut by the reek of adrenaline. Lorenzo ran, not because he was the boss, but because a reflex older than duty pulled him toward the fallen figure. It was Elena. She had been standing by a chain-link fence, the rain hissing across her hair, her hand clamped to the wound at her side. For all the years he'd trained himself to be insensitive to the blood of others, he had never prepared for the warmth of her life spilling onto his jacket. He caught her before she hit the gravel, his hands trembled despite a life built on steady hands. The rain mixed with the red on his shirt and made a new color he had no name for. Her breath was shallow, the pupils of her eyes were wide and stupid with shock. In a voice that felt as if it could tear, he demanded, "Who shot you?" Her whisper, when it came, scraped like rusted metal. Someone close, someone you trust. Those words cut deeper than the bullet, a verdict rendered without ceremony. Around them the convoy dissolved into motion, a blur of men and instructions and the flaring light of fear. But Lorenzo stood, radius of stillness in a world gone mad, and watched his empire tilt like a cathedral struck by an earthquake. The photograph under his unpaid invoices seemed suddenly lighter, as if it could float away. The tie at his throat felt too tight. Blood, the narrator observes, is a patient historian. It writes on fabric and skin what men like Lorenzo had striven to smudge from memory. As he pressed Elena's body closer, Lorenzo realized the rules that had held his life together had been rewritten without his consent. Loyalty had been traded like a stock on a market he'd never noticed existed. And in the new economy, the currency was names whispered behind closed doors. The inciting incident was not merely a bullet. It was a line drawn in wet ink across everything Lorenzo thought he knew. The city continued to breathe around them, indifferent and hungry. The king of the city, the man who had built empires on precise calculations and cold decisions, for the first time in years felt the disorienting and terrible tilt of not knowing. The narrator closes the scene with the image of crimson soaking white fabric, of rain trying and failing to wash truth away, and of a man who realizes his hands are stained with more than money. The safe house had the kind of silence that smells like old wood and older secrets. It sat behind a nondescript laundromat 2 blocks from the river, windows blacked out and a single door that only opened for those who knew the knock. Lorenzo had paid a man to build it and another man to forget it existed. That was how he had always operated, create layers of erasure until the truth was buried under other people's lies. Tonight the layers felt thin. He carried Elena across the threshold like a relic, as if by transporting her he could reverse whatever had been done to her. Inside, the place was all of his contradictions: tasteful furniture, a piano he never allowed anyone to touch, a wall of books he'd never read. He set her down on the couch with hands that refused to stop shaking. The blood on his shirt cooled into dark, drying maps. The contrast, a white sleeve that had once signified cleanliness now documented violence, made his stomach turn. He demanded names like a man reading a bill he did not expect. "Who shot you?" His voice, flat and practiced, carried the authority of 1,000 executed orders. He expected the usual: an enemy gang, a hit paid by a rival family, a stray bullet in a city that counted stray lives like change. But Elena looked at him and, for the first time since she collapsed, spoke with a clarity that bypassed the morphine and the sweat. "You built an empire, Lorenzo," she said, eyes too bright for someone whose life had been punctured. "But you forgot the one rule: never trust your own blood." The words landed like stones thrown through glass. Lorenzo had been surrounded by men who would swear allegiance until their throats were cut, and he had believed those oaths because that's what he'd been taught to believe. The idea of betrayal from within had been a theoretical problem, a chessboard possibility, but Elena's calm made it a living thing. She refused to fill in blanks. Refusal became a weapon sharper than any knife in his collection. Her sorrow was the loudest thing in the room, and it accused him in a way the others never had. He moved from decision to decision like a man pacing a room waiting for a verdict. He called for the inner circle. Marco arrived first, lean, quick, the kind of man whose face changed with the light. He had been with Lorenzo through the years when alliances were scraped from the asphalt, when favors were currency and trust a commodity. Johnny shuffled in behind him, ledger in hand, the accountant who reduced men to numbers and numbers to threats. Rosa came last, heavy-booted, muscle and silence stitched together, the enforcer whose hands had kept Lorenzo's rules palpable. They stood in the safe house like exhibits in a courthouse, each one playing their parts with the casual precision of men who'd rehearsed loyalty so often they believed in it. Lorenzo asked questions. He watched their pupils. He listened for microvariations in speech and breath. He expected to find fissures, something human in the eyes of men who had done monstrous things for him. He wanted to believe in their denials because it meant he could keep the world as he'd arranged it, clean lines, accounted favors. They denied involvement, all of them. Denials slid across the room like oil. But the oil left a residue. Tension thickened the air like humidity before a storm. Lorenzo felt the architecture of his life creak. He began to suspect them one by one because doubt is a contagion that spreads best in enclosed spaces. Marco's hands lingered on the pistol at his hip a second too long. Johnny's ledger contained transfers that smelled like evasions. Rosa's silence was too measured. It could mean loyalty, but it could also mean calculation. The question he had trained his life to answer, who shot her, began to yield to another, more corrosive question, why? Why, in a city where transactions were supposed to be predictable, had someone chosen this method, a bullet meant to bleed the past into the present? Was it a message to Lorenzo, a public dismemberment of his control? Or was it something intimate, crueler, the kind of betrayal that required knowledge of the man's rhythms, of the soft places he kept hidden? The why pushed at him like a persistent tide. It licked at his ankles and promised that if he did not step carefully, it would take him whole. And then, as fears fed on each other, Elena's fever rose. She slept in fits and started to talk in fragments, names and half-phrases that sounded like riddles. Lorenzo stayed by her, watching the rise and fall of her chest, listening for sense in scattershot syllables. In the small hours, when the city sounded like a distant predator, she breathed a name so soft he almost missed it, your brother. Time, for a man like Lorenzo, had always been tidy. Events had been queued and dealt with in order, like files stamped and shelved. A brother's name in that whisper shattered the neatness. His brother, Adrian DeLuca, was the family's mask of respectability. There had been a deal with daylight in Adrian's existence. He had been their family's legitimate face in politics, schools, charities, handshakes and marble lobbies. He wore clean suits and practiced smiles, and for years that was the separation Lorenzo cultivated, the shadow and the storefront, the things you bought in daylight and the things you bought at night. Lorenzo froze as if the floor had changed into quicksand. The room narrowed to the space between him and the couch. He pressed his fingers along the seam of the sofa, feeling the coarse weave as if it could anchor him to something solid. Memories rose like a tide, Lorenzo and Adrian as boys with scabbed knees, swearing with the solemnity of children that blood would always run in a single current between them. There had been pacts whispered under blankets, hands clasped in secret. They had promised to protect each other, to build something together that would keep other people from choosing their fate. Those promises had ossified into the architecture of the DeLuca name, until now. Flashbacks became a cinema in the periphery of his mind. He saw their father's face, a man with a velvet voice and a poker hand that never lost, telling them success required sacrifice. He saw the two boys trading small, private vows in dusty basements. He saw the first time they divided roles. Adrian would be the polished front, Lorenzo the hand that kept the lights on. They had believed that separation would keep them safe. They had been wrong. The empire had been their father's dream built on lies, and it was beginning to crack along those very seams. Lorenzo's moral crossroads wasn't clean. He could liquidate suspects like assets, one by one, and watch the world obey his edict. Kill the men who looked sideways at him, disappear the accountant with a ledger full of questions, remove the enforcer who might be quietly rearranging loyalties. He could do that and restore an order that hid the rot rather than excising it. The price would be more blood, the kind that stains a man's inner walls and hardens into a kind of calcified conscience. Or he could seek proof, patient, careful, which would mean admitting vulnerability, allowing the risk that the truth could be wider and uglier than he'd imagined. Lorenzo was not familiar with patience. His life had been a series of executed plans. Patience felt like a foreign currency. The narrator watches him as the weight of choice presses on his shoulders. Lorenzo paced through the safe house like a man mapping out a battlefield he cannot afford to lose. He tried to imagine asking his brother and seeing the reaction. Would Adrian be hurt, defensive, the practiced politician who stained his hands only with signatures and smiles? Or would Adrian's face as he lied be the honest mirror of a man who'd been protecting another kind of life? There was also the possibility that Adrian was innocent, that someone had used his public persona as camouflage. The thought offered him no solace. In his experience, masks were rarely clean. That night, as the city's pulse matched the erratic tempo of Elena's breathing, Lorenzo sat alone on the piano bench he had always left untouched. Song lines that once meant solace now sounded discordant in his head. He placed his fingers on the ivory without thinking and lifted them again. Music had been Elena's domain, it had been the language they had once shared when words were too small. He remembered her playing and him listening, imagining a life where music could be the architecture instead of ledger lines. Those memories were fragile things, eggshells thin and easily crushed, but they kept forming the contours of a man who had never learned how to be tender without cost. The safe house, suddenly, felt like a crossroads at a cemetery of promises. The people he trusted most, the men who had been part of the scaffolding of his rise, could be loyal or predators in disguise. The man who had always separated his life into compartments now realized the compartments might leak, and the liquid seeping through would drown him if he didn't act. His choices were moral and strategic, each with a calculus he was built to execute but never to forgive. Around them, the city continued its indifferent churn, deals struck under neon, police cars gliding with pretense, streetlights that cast long shadows on lonely sidewalks. But inside the safe house, the world had narrowed to a handful of faces and the possibility that the blood that had fallen tonight would not wash away, instead it would stain records, relationships, and histories in ways that could not be undone. Lorenzo's hands, once steady as the wheel of a train, showed the first tremor of doubt. He could obey the old law of his life, act fast, act hard, send a message, or he could trace the soft lines of Elena's whisper and follow where it led. Blood had named a brother. Loyalty had been questioned by a woman who had returned like a ghost with a bullet in her side. The moral crossroads was not a single signpost, it was a maze whose walls changed with every decision. Lorenzo knew, with a clarity that frightened him, that the wrong turn would not only end him but would probably swallow everything he tried to protect. The right turn might demand something he could not easily give: humility, patience, perhaps even forgiveness. As dawn threatened on the horizon, a pale and cautious thing leaking into the room, Lorenzo sat back and realized his life had always been an exercise in cruelty disguised as necessity. The safe house held its breath with him, as if the walls understood that what happened next would determine the shape of more than one destiny. He pressed his palms to his temples and tried to remember what it was to be a brother rather than a king. The internal struggle would not be resolved by nightfall, moral things seldom are. It would gnaw at him, present choices and consequences like cards shuffled in a hand he did not know how to read. The city would wait. The men would sharpen their knives. Elena would sleep and whisper fragments that would grow into accusations. And Lorenzo would have to choose which kind of man he wanted to be when the sun came up. They say the truth arrives like an earthquake, not at once, but in tremors that overturn everything balanced on the surface. For Lorenzo, the first tremor came in a file folder, thick, official, stamped in a way that made bureaucracy look like thunder. He had always trusted paper. Paper recorded favors, debts, and the neat arithmetic of power. But paper could also betray. The file lay on his desk in the safe house like a thing that had grown there, inevitable as mold. Inside were transcripts, wiretap summaries, photographs of meetings in rooms Lorenzo had not known Adrian entered. Names circled in red that matched faces he had trusted. Between totals and margins, Truth had found a way to spell his family's name in a language he hadn't expected. At first, he did what he had always done when presented with inconvenient information: he doubted the evidence rather than his assumptions. Men lie. Men betray. The city was a place where everyone sold something. But the voices in the file did not sound like lies, they were recorded on devices placed in places his men had once thought secure. There were pledges, maps of financial transfers, notes that detailed the chain of custody of things Lorenzo had never wanted in daylight. Adrian's signature, the politeness of a well-educated liar, hovered over documents that read like a confession written by someone with his own hands. The revelation was simple and devastating. Adrian, the polished face the family had cultivated for appearances and legitimacy, had been meeting with federal agents. The meetings were not thirsty grabs for power, not conspiracies for control. The file said, in its clinical, merciless way, that Adrian had been cooperating to dismantle the DeLuca enterprise. The reason was not greed. The reason was a carefully argued case that the family itself had become cancerous, that the only hope of preserving some part of the name lay in letting go of the empire they had built on blood. Lorenzo read the words and felt them as if they were punches. Cooperating with the state, it sounded like treachery when framed in rhetorical flourishes. But when stripped of rhetoric, the motive that the agents had recorded was painfully human: protection. Adrian spoke of donations for schools, of cleaning the family name, of time reversing the consequences of their father's choices. He had been trying to contain the fallout, to keep brothers and cousins and aunts from being dragged into cages the way others had been. He had imagined that a slow, surgical removal of the family's criminal branches might leave the trunk alive. Why didn't he tell me? Lorenzo asked the empty room. The question echoed like a stone dropped down a well. The answer, that Adrian had believed secrecy was the only way to keep them all safe, was a theological argument against the empire's jurisprudence. For a man who had made a life in rooms where decisions were cut and sewn like fabric, the idea that his brother had acted out of love and fear rather than ambition was corrosive. It split the world into parts he had not accounted for. But confession is never clean. Somewhere in the gutters of the revelation there was manipulation. The file suggested that someone had gone out of their way to make that cooperation appear treasonous, deliberately leaked intermediaries, staged meetings that could be framed as betrayal, and one very public act designed to shame the family. Elena's shooting was not a stray act of violence. It was a message packed with an accusatory signature: make the innocent appear guilty, and the house built on fear will implode from inside. The second tremor followed, a name that fell like a dropped coin, bright and ringing, then silent. Marco. Marco had been Lorenzo's right hand for a decade. He had been the man who took the first punches, paid the blood tolls, and returned with the receipts. He had eaten at the table where deals were carved and had sometimes eaten alone when men of consequence needed a quiet place to be cruel. Marco's face, in Lorenzo's memory, was a map of loyalty, a loyalty purchased in years of shared danger and cemented by mutual coldness. It was a comfort to know where someone stood on a field where positions changed with the wind. Marco's name was supposed to mean certainty. The file, and the men who came with corroboration, painted a different picture. Marco had been the architect. He had known Elena's routines, the hours she slipped unnoticed through back doors. He had provided the leak that placed her at the site when the sniper found the angle. He had made sure that the chain of custody of the frames brought evidence pointing to Adrian like fingerprints smudged over a document. His motive, pieced together like shards of ceramic, traced to an old calamity: the death of his father in a deal gone bad, a death for which Marco held Lorenzo, or the system Lorenzo represented, accountable. Revenge, the narrator muses, is a language everyone understands but few can translate without stumbling. Marco's calculus had been bitterly simple. He'd watched his father die in a transaction Lorenzo's people had run. He had been promised justice and been given the pale equivalent: time, position, and the veneer of advancement. In the hidden ledger of his heart, these were not consolation, they were insults. Marco had been patient, which is a dangerous thing in a man wronged. He had learned how to wait for a mistake and then turn that mistake into the architecture of another man's downfall. When Lorenzo confronted Marco, it was not with the violent theatrics of a mob film. It was with a single, hard question asked across a table where the safehouse's lamps turned men into statues. Lorenzo placed the transcripts before Marco, watched the color leave the younger man's face in a way Lorenzo had once believed he would save him. Marco looked at the evidence and then at the king of the city who once trusted him without reservation. There was none of the braggadocio Lorenzo expected. Instead, Marco's voice was the dry rasp of someone who had rehearsed anger into coldness. "I never wanted to hurt you," Marco said, and for a heartbeat Lorenzo believed there might be an apology. But the next words were a confession dressed as a verdict. Marco outlined the deal, the old violence, the promises he'd been fed that had withered into nothing, and how the only currency he had left was the ability to rewrite the narrative. He said he had orchestrated the ambush, had set Elena where the shooter could find a clean shot, had planted misleading trails for men who would be easy to frame. He had used Adrian as a shield because Adrian's clean public life made a plausible fall guy in a town desperate for scandal. The confession was brutal in its rationality. Marco did not speak like a monster savoring blood. He spoke like a man who had run the calculus of consequence and decided he would be the instrument of ruin. He insisted, or perhaps he simply defended himself, that Adrian's cooperation with federal agents had reached a point where it threatened to dismantle everything he considered to be justice. Marco's argument was warped but coherent. The family structure needed collapse to be rebuilt differently, with penalties and recompense balanced the way he imagined justice should be balanced. "You killed my father," Marco said finally, as if drama were something that needed staging. "You chose the world you wanted. My father paid for it. I chose to make sure that the world you built could be broken. Not for money. For consequence." Lorenzo felt the room tilt. Years of shared blood and shared violence had not prepared him for the claim that he was responsible for a man's death within his orbit, an accusation that rewired his memories. He had killed men before, he had authorized violence like a magistrate signs warrants. Yet Marco's grief was a kind of mirror that reflected a face Lorenzo had not wanted to see. The revelation upended the comfortable lie that the wrongs done under his orders were always, in some democratic sense, necessary. Sometimes orders produce unidentifiable corpses, and those corpses breed rage in sons who then learn to be patient in their hatred. The confrontation escalated, not with bullets but with a weight of history. Marco's explanation seemed to boil down to this: the violence that Lorenzo had normalized had seeped into ordinary lives, and Marco had turned that seep into a weapon recalibrated for moral balance. He had been the hand that set the dominoes falling. Lorenzo wanted to answer with a sentence that would reclaim the frame, to remind Marco of the debts paid, the protection afforded, the lives saved by the decisions made in rooms like this. But Marco's motive was not simple, it was too embroidered with wrong and consequence to be dismissed. The man who had been his shield had become a surgeon with a blade aimed not at a throat but at the nerve that would make Lorenzo feel everything he had for so long blunted. The unraveling did not stop with confessions. It produced new, smaller, unbearable truths. Elena, weak and still bled out, a ghost wrapped in bandages, watched the exchange like a jury in a courtroom. Her presence made the argument into something more than an intellectual exercise. She had been the body at the center of the controversy, she had been the victim, yes, but also the keeper of a secret more delicate than the file on Lorenzo's desk. When Marco's voice hardened and when Lorenzo's eyes narrowed, she moved. She stepped toward Marco, the slow gait of someone who wanted to sow rather than tear. Her face was pale and the wound at her side made each step an insult to human fragility. She looked at him, and then at Lorenzo, and in the exhausted, ragged clarity people sometimes find in pain, she spoke. "If you spill more blood, you'll never escape it," she said. Her voice was a brittle thing, shaped by morphine and resolve. It was not a plea for mercy for Marco as much as a command to Lorenzo, to stop the cycle. She was the one who carried the bullet that linked the brothers' portraits and the men who orbited them. Her words cut through the room's noise and left a silence so full it could be mistaken for sacredness. The narrator watches Lorenzo's hands, hands that had signed warrants and death sentences, tremble. He had always been the man to make the hard choice, the man who preferred the certainty of action over the uncertainty of reflection. Elena's sentence, simple and moral, demanded he consider a different currency, the cost of blood on the soul. For the first time since the safe house, Lorenzo felt something other than calculation. He felt the shape of consequence in the raw, human geometry of Elena's phrase. If he killed Marco now, would he be avenging a father or perpetuating the very logic that produced the father's death? If he let Marco live, would he be consenting to a kind of moral law where revenge organizes itself into institutions? The question was a Mobius strip of culpability, any answer looped back upon itself. He raised his gun, the action as automatic as breathing, and felt the weight settle into his palm. He stood over Marco like a god in a fragile pantomime, the barrel pointing with honest intent. The room tightened around him, air thick and hot. He could hear his own breathing like another man's. He could hear the clock ticking in the hallway, a metronome for decision. The safe house, which had been an edifice of careful control, watched as Lorenzo considered translating moral calculus into violence. Then his hand betrayed him. It shook. A small thing, a physiological betrayal, but enough. The gun slipped from his grip and hit the floor with a sound that was too loud, too human. Everyone heard it. Marco's eyes widened not in fear but in the blank astonishment of someone who had bargained with a life and lost the receipt. Lorenzo felt the shock of absurdity. The instrument of power had failed at the most crucial moment. He could have stooped, picked it up, and finished the transaction his life had trained him to complete. Instead, he sat down, as if a sudden fatigue had emptied him. Elena's words were a hand on his shoulder. The decision, violent, clear, and irreversible, would not be made in a gun's flash. It would be an act of restraint, of abandoning the easy solace of blood for the harder work of facing truth. In that pause, the empire began to crack not because of a raid or a trial, but because its leader chose to let the architecture wobble rather than reinforce it with more violence. The narrator notes the strange alchemy of that moment. Empires, built on certainty, often crumble when their leaders start to doubt. Lorenzo's gun falling was less an end than a beginning. It signified that a man who had defined himself by decisions could, in one broken pulse, choose to accept the moral chaos that came with truth. The empire would not vanish overnight. Men like Marco could still choose to fight, and Adrian's could still be fragile shields. But the decision not to spill more blood cracked open an avenue for something else: accountability, confession, perhaps even a sort of atonement that would not be bought with more corpses. Outside, the city breathed on, indifferent to the small mercy given in a dim room behind a laundromat. Inside, Marco sat with guilt turned glassy. Lorenzo finished the file and closed it with hands that trembled less than before. He picked up the gun, placed it on the table, and left it there as a relic rather than an instrument. He did not hand it to Marco. He did not make a show of mercy. He simply refused to become an executioner in his own orchestra of violence. The unraveling continued: investigations, rumors, patched loyalties, the slow unspooling of schemes, but its most violent engine had been arrested by a decision that felt like surrender. The narrator imagines the ripple: men on the street puzzling over a leader who would not kill, federal agents reassessing deals, Adrian searching for a brother in a structure that no longer seemed to protect him. Elena kept her secret for reasons of her own, and in protecting that secret she became both martyr and mediator. Lorenzo's empire did not end because someone pulled a trigger. It began to end because its king, who had once believed in the purity of control, allowed ambiguity, the most dangerous of human conditions, into his life. The twist was not merely who betrayed whom, it was that the man who had once defined himself by certainty chose, finally, to embrace doubt. And in that embrace, the rules of the game changed forever. The childhood home sits where memory thinks it should, a narrow house with a stoop worn smooth by small, impatient feet, a backyard where two boys once learned to hide bones and secrets, a kitchen that remembers arguments as if they were scents in the wallpaper. For Lorenzo, returning there is like opening a volume of a book he has read 1,000 times only to find new stains on a page. He had not planned for this to be the theater of his reckoning. Nothing Lorenzo planned ever looked like a confession, but fate, or some grimmer architecture of consequence, often prefers the places where you first learn to be who you are. Marco's escape was not the cinematic sprint men think it will be. It was a series of small, effective choices: a door ajar, a lookout who owed a debt and called it in, a diversion made of shouts and smoke that scattered Lorenzo's men into the dark. One moment the safe house felt like a sieve leaking certainty, the next moment Marco was gone and Adrian was gone with him, a pale, practiced public face crumpled into the awful intimacy of blood and fear. Lorenzo watched the van take them away as if he were a man watching one of his own towers being dismantled brick by brick. He did not chase immediately. That would have been the easy script. Instead, he traced the lines of betrayal back to a childhood map, the house on the corner, the alley that smelled like lemon from the grocer, the porch where the two brothers had once bled and promised to protect each other. It felt obscene to return, and necessary. He had to. The house was the kind of place that preserves echoes. The wallpaper still held a faint impression where a scratch had been made years ago. The piano in the parlor had a missing key that no one had learned to fix because nobody had wanted to touch the instrument that reminded them of better things. Adrian's footsteps had once been small and careful there, a rehearsal for public appearances. Lorenzo's had been larger, used to pounding. Tonight the place felt like a film set in which the living might be reduced to props. When Marco arrived with Adrian, he did so with the showman's instinct for spectacle. He wanted the place where the brothers had vowed fidelity to be its own witness. The van stopped 2 blocks away so as not to make noise. The men who followed Marco through the gate were lean and balanced, not clumsy. Adrian's hands were bound. His suit, the one the public knew him in, was stained with mud and the dark bloom of blood. He wore the look of a man who had been forced to trade his image for flesh and had found the trade uneconomical. Marco brought them into the kitchen like a man rehearsing for a trial. He paced the yellow linoleum and described, with calm cruelty, the narrative he had constructed. He wanted Lorenzo present so that the collapse would be personal. He wanted a haunted audience for the confession that would, in his mind, be the final balance sheet. In Marco's view, debts were the kind of things that accrued interest in the hearts of those who had lost fathers for the ledger of profit. You think I wanted this? Marco's voice was a low thing, dangerous in its quiet. Do you think I wanted to be the kind of man who built a set to humiliate another? I wanted justice, Lorenzo. I wanted the truth to come with consequence. He circled Adrian as if the younger man were an exhibit. Your brother wanted to save us. He wanted to stop more boys from dying. Adrian, for his part, looked smaller than the life he had built. The politician's stance, the practiced smile, the calibrated outrage, had been stripped away, revealing a man who had made a bargain and carried the shame of its conditions like an internal scar. There was fear in his eyes, yes, but there was also something like determination, the kind a man wears when he believes he has done what must be done. Lorenzo stood in the doorway and watched the room rearrange itself into a theater of choices. He had known, in the way men who are used to maps know distances, that a day like this might come. He felt an old muscle clench, the part of him that measured outcomes in immediate terms. The old code said you do not let your family be raw meat on the street. The new question asked whether family was the architecture that made such offerings necessary in the first place. Marco made his demands, not for money but for moral accounting. He wanted an admission. He wanted Lorenzo to stand in a room where a cigarette had once been put out on a table and say that they had been wrong, that their family's empire had been built on a lie. Such an admission, in Marco's calculus, would be equivalent to payment. The standoff broke like a glass. A gunshot, sudden and pure, bounced off plaster and sent crystals of shattered light into the air. The room erupted into a choreography of violence. Men moved, the table overturned, a flower pot went flying, the piano's missing key struck a discordant note and held it. Gunfire is not cinematic at close range. It is abrupt, animalistic, and immediate. Lorenzo reacted from conditioned muscle, a step, a twist, a throw of weight meant to throw another man off balance. The first bullet ripped through the paneling and embedded itself in the kitchen clock that had once ticked reassuringly. The second found a shoulder. Adrian moved without thinking in a way that long precedes politics and reputation. He stepped between Marco and Lorenzo with a speed that betrayed the bone-deep reflexes of men who have always thought themselves keepers. He took a round in the shoulder that burned with instant heat. The politician folded inward, surprise and pain birthing an animal sound. Blood seeped into his shirt and darkened his tie like an oil spill. For a heartbeat, the house reduced itself to the metallic taste of blood and the small bitter scent of gunpowder. Marco did not aim to kill Adrian. That would have been too simple and too honest. He aimed to wound him in a way that would force confession, an outcome he thought would expose the rot. Yet even as Adrian crumpled, Lorenzo realized that the violence had become the public's language for truth, and that was precisely the problem. Violence tells stories faster than thought, but the stories it tells are often incomplete. Lorenzo moved toward his brother. The house had shrunk to the space between them, a kitchen scarred by children's games, a porch that once held whispered promises, the smell of lemon and cleaning soap that could not, tonight, clean anything. He saw the red spreading across Adrian's shirt and felt an unexpected knifing pain, not physical but something like bitterness at the sight of his own flesh made vulnerable. He realized, in a shock cleaner than any regret he had felt in years, that Adrian's wound mirrored a wound in himself. One brother's injury reflected the cost of their shared past. Marco's men surged. The sound of boots on linoleum was a drumbeat for a battle Lorenzo had not wanted to wage in a house that had taught him how to love. He fired once. The bullet caught one of Marco's lieutenants in the leg and sent the man collapsing against the stove. Glass shattered, a chandelier rattled and threw light across faces he'd rather not have seen. Marco fired back, a hand steady despite the storm he had unleashed. Each shot was a raw punctuation to a conversation that had not been able to remain verbal. In the boiling atom of the conflict, confessions tend to arrive with a kind of savage clarity. Marco, in a moment of near delirium, spoke of the men he had lost, the father he had watched die in a deal Lorenzo had orchestrated, the small boy who had been raised in the absence of a father's guiding hand. He spoke of promises gone unfulfilled and bargains made with the language of necessity. He painted their life as if he were a tour guide at the ruins of their collective choices. "You can't wash off blood, King," he spat near the end, the words leaving him on a breath that trembled between accusation and a kind of dark prayer. It was more than a taunt, it was a summation of the lesson Marco had taken to heart, that the stain of violence is not just physical but genealogical. Marco's final phrase hung in the air like a verdict. The last stand, as the narrator watches it, was not a grand tableau of good and evil. It was chaotic, intimate, and mercilessly honest. Men fell where they had stood for reasons of loyalty, injury, or miscalculation. The house took casualties in ways that made the bystander realize the old systems based on fear and retribution are inherently unstable. Marco found himself wounded as the tide of the room turned against him. His breath came short. He slumped to the floor and, for the first time in his life, looked small and mortal. Lorenzo did what he had been trained to do and what he had avoided. He closed distance and watched the man who had once been his shield become the man who had pierced the heart of his order. Marco's eyes found Lorenzo's and, in the depth of them, Lorenzo read the years of grievance sown like a crop. The man who had orchestrated an implosion lay dying, clutching at the fabric of a life he had tried to remake into something resembling justice. It is in the quiet after violence that truths sometimes arrive. Adrian, cradled in Lorenzo's arms, breathed raggedly. The surgeon's hands of adrenaline did what they could. Lorenzo felt for a pulse, counted breaths like a man counting the losses at a ledger. In the heat of the kitchen, he realized that his empire's rules, the calculus of fear and fidelity, had produced a geometry where every action produced not just reaction, but a multiplication of grief. Marco's last breath was a small, rough thing. He managed, barely, to whisper a repetition of his earlier phrase, as if to brand the final lesson into the air. "You can't wash off blood, King," he said again, much quieter, the sentence breaking on the last syllable. It was not triumph. It was a statement of fate. Stains do not lift easily, they become part of the fabric. When the gunfire finally subsided, the house held a silence so thin it could have been peeled away. The aftermath in the kitchen felt like the end of a long play. People lay scattered, some moaning, some not moving at all. The chandelier's light swung gently, throwing a fractured glow over faces etched with exhaustion and grief. Lorenzo sat down on the worn floor beside his brother and felt a tiredness that was not only physical, it was the weariness of a man who had run scenarios his entire life and now found his assumptions bankrupt. Adrian's breathing stabilized into a shallow, honest rhythm. He coughed and tasted blood. He looked up at Lorenzo with an expression that had the rawness of a man who had made a hard bargain for the good he thought he could save. "You didn't have to," he began, but the sentence dissolved in a whisper. Lorenzo touched the blood at his brother's temple as if to prove he was real. The gesture was primal and tender, it was not regal. It was the motion of a brother, unadorned by titles. Elena was not there in person to witness the homecoming, but in the threadbare way the story had been stitched together she remained its moral center. Word had come, delayed, as these things are when pain pulls breath like taffy, that she had been stabilized by men who owed loyalty beyond invoices. Her condition was fragile, alive, yes, but with the kind of wounds that speak loud in medicine and louder in conscience. The narrator's presence in Lorenzo's mind keeps returning to a phrase she had used the night of the ambush: "You can still start over." The resolution of Lorenzo's internal conflict did not happen in a single cinematic moment. It unfurled like a map being smoothed out across a table. He could have finished Marco then and cut the story into half-sentences that would become legend: king kills traitor, family breaks, empire endures. Instead, as he watched his brother breathe and heard Marco's last ragged mantric phrase fade, he felt something like the beginning of a different accounting. The promise he and Adrian had made as children, to look after each other, returned to him not as a political calculation but as an ethical imperative. Power, in his mind, suddenly seemed cheap if its price was the souls around him. The life he had built could not be measured only in ledgers and loyalty, it was measured by the broken bodies and disappointed eyes in the wake of its exertions. Marco's cruelty had been a mirror held up to the consequences of Lorenzo's choices. He had always believed he governed with necessity, now he saw, with brutal clarity, the human receipts of those necessities. Adrian squeezed Lorenzo's hand weakly. "If we're to start over," he rasped, voice rough with pain, "it will be messy. It will be public. People will hate us. But perhaps," he coughed, a dry, painful sound. "Perhaps fewer people die." Lorenzo nodded, the gesture an admission that throbbed beneath the skin. He knew the path forward would not be clean. He understood that stepping away from the architecture of fear required more than a decision, it required sacrifice, exposure, and the willingness to trade control for uncertainty. But for the first time in a long time, he believed the trade might be worth the price. Outside the house, the city carried on with its indifferent rhythms: traffic, gossip, lives stitched into patterns that would not easily change. Inside the house, on a linoleum floor dotted with spilled coffee and blood, a king and his brother counted breaths and measured the cost of a life that had been refashioned by violence and grief. Marco's body was moved from the kitchen into the night, his last words and plans crumpled like paper. Elena's fate remained a fragile hinge between hope and despair. Lorenzo's empire would not vanish tomorrow. Men loyal to old bargains would howl like wolves at the scent of softness. But the choice he made in that kitchen, to stop the cycle, to allow doubt to enter where certainty had stood like a wall, had already begun to reshape the game. The moral payoff of the hour was not clean redemption. It was, instead, the beginning of a long and lonely project, to replace fear with accountability and to learn, painfully, how to let blood become a story rather than a currency. As the narrator closes the act, he lingers on an image: Lorenzo sitting on the stoop outside the childhood home with Adrian asleep in a chair inside, the house breathing like a chest. The night smells faintly of lemon and wet earth. The city hums in the distance. The king is no longer untouched, his hands are stained and shaky. But the stain has altered him. He will have to answer to the world he helped shape. He will have to explain the choices he makes in the light rather than behind curtains. And perhaps, the narrator suggests, that is how empires end, not with a single, glorious fall, but with a series of small moral capitulations that make room for something else to grow. The weeks that followed unfolded like the slow decay of a once loud song, the kind that lingers in the mind long after the final note has vanished. The city, which had once whispered Lorenzo's name in tones of reverence and fear, no longer spoke of him at all. Power is a language that forgets its speakers quickly. His empire, the intricate network of loyalty and intimidation that had taken decades to build, dissolved quietly, like paper left too long in the rain. His men scattered, some found new kings to serve, some found graves, and a few simply vanished into the shadows that had once been his domain. The safe houses were raided, the ledgers burned, the alliances reduced to rumor. For the first time since his youth, Lorenzo de Luca walked unrecognized. He spent his days in a chapel on the outskirts of the city, a place so forgotten that even the priest had stopped asking his name. The air there was always cool, and it smelled of old wood, melted wax, and ghosts. He didn't pray, men like Lorenzo never truly learned how, but he sat there, motionless, beneath the dim light that filtered through the stained glass. He found something in the silence that neither money nor blood had ever offered him: space. The pew creaked when he shifted his weight, the sound startling in its honesty. Outside, the bells tolled every hour as if reminding him that time was something he could no longer command. Sometimes he thought of Adrian, his brother, who survived the gunfire but not the weight of what came after. Adrian disappeared into anonymity, shedding his political face like a snakeskin. No one knew where he went, though a letter arrived once, unsigned, containing only a single line: "You were right to stop." Lorenzo kept it folded in his pocket, not because he needed proof that Adrian lived, but because those 4 words reminded him that even fractured bonds could hum faintly across distance. Elena recovered slowly, her body marked by the bullet, her spirit changed in ways that medicine could not touch. The last time he saw her, she was standing in the doorway of the chapel. Morning light carved gold into her hair, and for a heartbeat, she looked like the echo of something divine. She didn't speak, and neither did he. There were too many words they could never use: forgiveness, love, ruin, regret, and so they let silence do what language never could. She turned, walked out into the street, and disappeared into the city's hum. Lorenzo didn't follow. He knew now that love was not possession, and that sometimes the most human act is to let a ghost stay a ghost. In the weeks that stretched into months, the city reshaped itself. New faces took the throne of the underworld, new legends rose to fill the silence he left behind. The skyline at night looked the same, neon, rain-soaked, flickering, but it carried a different kind of energy now, less fear and more hunger. Lorenzo watched from a distance, unarmed and unremarkable, a man with no crown, no court, and no enemies left to conquer. There was a strange peace in obscurity, a quiet he hadn't realized he'd been craving all along. The narrator watches him now as he walks through streets that once bent under his shadow. He passes corners where his name had once been currency and is greeted instead with indifference. He doesn't resent it. Power, he realizes, had been a fever, and he has finally broken it. He buys coffee from a street vendor who doesn't know him, stands in line behind men who would have once stepped aside for him, and listens to the rhythm of the world as if learning it anew. Every siren, every laugh, every passing bus feels like proof that life, indifferent, relentless life, continues without kings. On the 7th week, when the rains returned, Lorenzo found himself at the pier. The city stretched before him like a bruise, beautiful in its damage. He stood there for hours, his hands resting on the railing slick with mist, the cold seeping into his bones. The skyline shimmered with the reflection of its own sins, every light mirrored and distorted on the water's trembling surface. He thought of her then, Elena, and of the night she fell bleeding into his arms. The way the rain had mixed with her blood, how her whisper had pierced through the thunder: "Someone close, someone you trust." That sentence had rewritten his life. He remembered the terror in her eyes, the confession, the years of empire that collapsed with a single shot. He also thought of Adrian, the boy who had sworn to protect him, the man who had nearly died doing it. And he thought of Marco, his most loyal traitor, his reflection in a cracked mirror, who had whispered as he died, "You can't wash off blood, King." Those words had stayed with him like an unhealed scar. But now, standing before the restless water, Lorenzo understood something he hadn't before. The stain Marco spoke of wasn't meant to be washed away. It was meant to be carried, not as guilt, but as memory. It was the price of knowing. The rain began again, light at first, then heavier, until the world blurred into streaks of gray and silver. He didn't move. The cold water ran down his face, mingling with the salt of something else, tears, maybe, or just the memory of them. He closed his eyes and whispered to the wind, "Even kings fall." The words surprised him, they came out gentler than he expected. Then, after a pause, softer still, "But sometimes, falling is the only way to rise again." The line wasn't meant for anyone else. It was a kind of confession, the kind that doesn't absolve but acknowledges. For the first time, Lorenzo didn't feel the need to justify what he'd been or what he'd lost. He simply existed, a man standing where one life had ended and another had quietly begun. He had learned that redemption doesn't come wrapped in miracles or applause, it comes in the form of silence you can finally live inside. Later that night, when the city's lights softened under the weight of the storm, he walked back through the old streets. Every corner was haunted by echoes, laughter, shouts, gunfire, love. He passed the alley where it all began, the narrow cut of darkness where Elena had fallen into his arms. Time had stripped it of its menace. The walls were still damp, the air still smelled of rust and rain, but the blood was gone. Only the memory remained, invisible, but indelible. He stood there a long time, watching the rain cascade down the brick, and it almost felt like the world was breathing again. The alley was empty now, washed clean, silent. Yet, as the narrator observes, some silences do not erase, they preserve. No rain could ever wash away memory. That's the paradox of cleansing, it removes the evidence but not the essence. The ground might have forgotten the blood, but the city had not. Somewhere in its pulse, the story of Lorenzo de Luca was still alive, not as legend or warning, but as something smaller and truer. A reminder that even the most feared men are still human, still capable of love, still breakable. Lorenzo took one last look at the place where his life had changed. The neon from a distant sign flickered red against the puddles, painting the alley in the same color it once knew too well. For a fleeting moment, he imagined seeing her there, Elena, turning back with that half-smile she used to wear when she played the piano, when the world still seemed soft. He knew she wasn't really there. Some ghosts return only to remind you they've left. He whispered her name once, so quietly that even the rain didn't bother to answer. Then he turned and walked away, leaving the alley to its solitude. The city around him continued its restless breathing, cars hissing through the wet streets, voices echoing from unseen places. The world, indifferent and alive, didn't pause for his exit. But the narrator lingers on him as he moves through the mist, a man without title, without followers, stripped of everything but the weight of his choices. There is something beautiful in his anonymity, something almost sacred in the quiet collapse of a kingdom that had once fed on noise. Back at the chapel, the candles burned low. Lorenzo entered without a sound, sat in the same pew, and watched the flame flicker against the stained glass. The colors danced across his hands, red, blue, gold, like remnants of the past projected onto flesh. He thought of Adrian's letter, of Elena's silence, of Marco's dying words, and he realized that every life, no matter how dark, leaves behind it small, trembling lights. He closed his eyes. The city could have him now. He no longer needed to own it. Outside, dawn began to crawl over the skyline, slow and hesitant. The rain had stopped. The streets glistened with reflected light, and for the first time in years, the city looked almost innocent. Somewhere far away, a piano played, soft, hesitant notes drifting through an open window. He didn't know if it was real or just memory, but he smiled anyway. In another life, he would have followed the sound. In this one, he simply listened. And so, the story ends where it began, with rain, silence, and the ghost of something like love. The alley remains, the city breathes, the world continues. The empire of Lorenzo de Luca becomes another whispered myth told in bars and backrooms, stripped of its truth by retelling, reshaped into legend. But the narrator, who has seen behind the curtain, knows the truth: there was no empire, no king, no victory. There was only a man who finally learned that control was never power, it was fear. That love was not weakness, it was the only form of strength he'd ever truly had. The final image stays fixed, the camera of memory returns to that same alley, the wet bricks, the narrow path, the dripping light from a half-dead street lamp. The place looks smaller now, ordinary, reclaimed by time. The puddles ripple in the faint wind, carrying the reflection of a city that has already forgotten its ghosts. There is no music, no voice, just the faint hum of existence. And as the narrator's gaze lingers, one truth remains: no rain, no matter how heavy, can wash away memory. The screen of the world fades to black, leaving only the echo of rain, and in that echo, the faint heartbeat of a man who once ruled everything and learned, at last, how to be human. If this story struck something deep, if you've ever loved someone who became your weakness, share this story with someone who'll understand. Leave your thoughts in the comments, tell us what you felt, what you saw, what stayed with you. And if you want more stories where power trembles, love bleeds, and redemption finds its way through ruin, subscribe to CineVerse Stories. Because every empire has a heart. And every heart has a breaking point.